You're listening to Breaking the Silence on the Fight the Lies Radio Network. Hi, this is Mike, and this is episode 6 of Breaking the Silence. I have as a guest here, my first-time guest, Tyrone Barnes. He's someone who me and my wife, Kelly, met on Facebook in one of the groups we were both in, and we've come to have this friendship. We actually met in real life back in, when was it?
That was Memorial Day.
Memorial Day, yes. And I got to say, for the record, man, I think I said it before, you have the most awesome family. I was really blown away by them. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say that because, well, you know, I think I said this before we parted ways that day, that it was sort of an awkward proposition to me to go and hang out, not knowing your family or anything. And, well, what are they going to think of me? And, I mean, I felt incredibly comfortable, and I just think, you know, I'm not saying this in an insincerely flattering way, that I think your family is a shining example that goes against the stereotypes that we see out there. I mean, from everything I had conversations with your mom about homeschooling and about just, you know, political views and biblical views and everything else. And let me tell you, man, it is a rare thing that I have a conversation with someone that we share those views in common. Usually it ends up in an argument or something, or agreeing to disagree.
Yeah, I'm sure they would be very, very thankful to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think you have a wonderful family, man, and you know, it's a really good thing to see, man. It's really encouraging, especially today. But anyway, so as we get started here, just, I guess, introduce yourself to everyone and who you are, what you do, and what you believe.
Well, hello, dear listener. As you said, I am Tyrone Barnes to everybody who knows me personally. That's not my legal name, but we won't go over that. Professionally, I work primarily in government contracting to make ends meet in order to pay the bills, but I am also currently earning my master's degree as an artist. I have an undergraduate degree as an artist as well. I'm going for my master's degree. In fact, while I'm talking with Mike here, I'm actually working on my thesis project for my master's. It's going to be an illustration. I'm aiming to be a concept artist and visual development artist for a number of studios, and it's been a long trek, but I think I'm finally starting to improve in some ways. So that's what I've been doing professionally with myself for many years now. In my identity in the Lord, I was raised in a church-going family. I was raised in a Bible-believing family. I cannot deny that. But I can't say that I really became serious and really took personally my faith until I was met with opposition to my faith when I was going to liberal arts school for my undergraduate degree. You understand? When I was going to a liberal arts school, there were days when I felt like I was a minority because I was straight, for example. Not just Christian, but just heterosexual and cisgendered at times.
Wow.
So I was in an environment where there was a lot of blatant and explicit hostility, not just to the Christian faith, but to many of the underlying metaphysical and philosophical underpinnings of basic traditional monotheism. And it was then it kind of dawned on me, like, if I'm supposed to be a disciple for the Lord, I'm going to have to be able to bring up subjects and material and talking points that would engage and challenge those who do not share my basic convictions. I'm going to have to find a way to be able to engage with those kinds of people on some level, because I know perfectly well just reciting Bible verses to them isn't going to get us anywhere. All they're doing is more or less just solidifying them in their unbelief rather than helping to wean them out of it. So ever since then, I started picking up certain books, I started reading, I started listening to debates and other high intellectuals who are making a living out of defending the Christian faith in the public unbelieving sphere, and it's a habit that I've carried with me ever since then, and it carries on with me to this day. And I honestly do think that good chunk of my calling is in the particular field of discipleship, of trying to reach and engage people who are not part of our ideological camp, so to speak. And that's why I'm glad to be able to speak with someone like Mike and Kelly, who come from backgrounds like that, who are intellectually engaging with their faith, not and their faith, but they actually take their faith as a calling to be intellectually engaging and intellectually rigorous. And that's something I will always appreciate and always respect and always on the lookout for.
Well, thank you. I would totally agree. Same sentiment. It's really rare, I think, that when we talk about faith, people have this conception of faith being blind, but it's not blind at all. It's based on evidence. Yeah, there's a boundary that we have to cross or approach that says, well, you have to just take this as a matter of trust. But there's so much that moment is built upon. And the world doesn't see that because really, honestly, and people I know think that I'm critical of other believers probably, but I think honestly a lot of that blame falls upon us as a greater body and these sort of erroneous teachings of just blind faith and don't question anything. And if you're a child, for example, and you ask your parent, why did this happen in the Bible? Like, perfect example. No one ever calls this out, man. Balaam and his donkey, Shrek and donkey, as I often call him.
Yes.
People criticize the Bible for all these various things, but it's ironic to me. I never hear anyone point that particular one out. But I think that's a perfect example of a kid somewhere I know at some point has asked their parent, well, how did that happen? What's that all about? Was the donkey really talking? And honestly, probably most parents in that scenario would probably just say, oh, it happened. The Bible says it happened. And, that's it. And honestly, it's probably just because they don't have the answer.
Right.
But I think it's, just sort of an example to illustrate that sort of approach that I think people don't have the answer. And partially that's because they don't dig and try to look for the answer. And I think that it is due a lot to teachers who don't really challenge people to question their faith and research. I mean, we have this matrix called the Bible in our hands that has so much in there, so many nuances that people just breeze right through. It's like everybody hates reading Leviticus. Uh-huh. And there is so much to Leviticus that if you just read it and let yourself enjoy it, man, you go down so many trails. It's amazing. But anyways, you're the person here being interviewed. People hear my opinions all the time, so I'm going to try to keep myself in check here.
So, just touching upon that, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's actually a violation of a biblical obligation. It's written, I think it's in one of the epistles of Peter, that one of our obligations as disciples is to always have an answer for those who ask for the reasons for the hope that we have.
Yes.
And that's like the apologist's go-to verse. Like we're always supposed to be able to intellectually engage with people as to why we know our faith to be not just something that we hold personally, but to be objectively true. And our vision saying that there is only one God and the historical person Jesus of Nazareth was his begotten son is just a factual statement to us as saying that penguins are flightless birds. So just as we should be able to demonstrate to people that penguins are flightless birds, we should be able to demonstrate to them the basic tenets of our faith. In fact, that's what we are commanded to do in Scripture, and so many of us are tragically failing in that because it seems to be too demanding on us. It could be a token of laziness. It could be a token of pride. It could be a token of tribalism, which is oftentimes fueled by pride and fear. It could be a number of personal obstacles to us actually fulfilling the duties and commandments of our faith that is really crippling us, at least in this part of the world.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, what you said about demonstrating our faith, giving evidence. I mean, look, after all, Yeshua, Jesus, he did that very thing himself. I mean,
absolutely.
Most everything he did was to demonstrate who he is. I mean, if he heals one blind person, right? I mean, there's how many millions of blind people in the world, and he did not go and heal those other million blind people because he didn't want to, and he didn't heal that one person because they were somehow better, but he did it for a reason, and it was to show who he was.
Right.
And I think that we don't take that same task upon ourselves. I mean, there was another trail of thought I had as you were talking. There's another very important reason that we should do this, and that's because of all the false teachings that are out there that have been out there for 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, Paul said, hey, research, question. You know, it's like the Bereans, right?
Mm-hmm. They question. The exact thing he said is, never allow anyone to deceive you. What I'm trying to remember, he said something to a group of people. I'm speaking in non-specifics here. And the group of people, when they heard what Paul had said to them, instead of just blindly believing what Paul had said, they went out and researched it themselves. And when Paul caught wind of that, he didn't respond by puffing up his chest and saying, how dare you question me? He actually praised and commended them for their intellectual rigor and encouraged them to continue to do so.
Yes.
Yes, and that's precisely what we as disciples should always be doing. And good Lord, I really wish you would tell me exactly what his specific words were, because it's something that I've written into my heart and always take to task. Oh, put all teachings to the test so that no one may deceive you. That's what he said.
Yes, there you go.
That includes his teachings as well. That includes anybody's teachings. Put it all to the test so that no one may deceive you. Because if they can deceive you, they can control you, and then you are no longer part of the true and wonderful liberty and freedom that a life in the Lord promises to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you've heard enough of our story that we came out of that sort of situation of where once we didn't question things, and I even refused to allow myself to question things. And then once I did, well, they had that exact opposite response that Paul had. It was, how dare you question things? And I think that's really all too common, tragically enough, that when people in churches do begin to approach a leader and say, hey, I'm reading this in the Bible and I'm just wondering about that, they get crushed.
Oh, yeah.
And sadly, there's two sad points here. One is that a lot of those people end up leaving the faith, which honestly, I'm one who I came to the conclusion, at least, that when Yeshua died for us, he didn't just die for the sins that I committed in my past, right, but he also died for the sins that I'm going to commit in the future. And it's not a license for us to nonchalantly sin, but we can have confidence that for him, all these things are in the past, that therefore we can't lose that which he gave to us. And let me tell you, I had the exact opposite point of view. Like, I spent every day worried about my salvation. And anyways, my first point is that, again, a lot of people end up leaving the faith, though if they truly have the faith, I don't think ultimately that they have left. But they go through a lot of, wilderness experience and pain. And secondly, what's sad to me is that I've been told, because of what we went through, that it's amazing that we didn't do that. And to that, I say, what's sad is that, to me, that should be the norm. I don't see myself as I had some great endurance or strength or anything. It was just that I guess I always had this sort of simple view that, wait, there's people and there's God, and right, God is the one who saved me. And these bad things that were done, they weren't done by God. So I never had that moment of blaming God for it.
Right.
And it's not because I'm so great, man. It's just that simple thing was evident to me. And I see it as tragic that would be unusual, that someone would praise me for that,
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of strange that all these counterattacks, if they can even be calling it that, I think that's giving them a little too much credit. When these authorities who are questioned by their congregation and respond in this rather personal attack, it really is sad to me that the people who originally presented the challenge cannot recognize that this is a categorical cognitive or intellectual fallacy in which they're saying that everything you're saying is invalidated or unjustified simply because you're not in a leadership position. In critical reasoning, we call that an ad hominem attack.
Yes.
And you try to show that a claim is false or unjustified by attacking the nature or the character of the person making the claim, rather than contending with the merits or demerits of the claim itself. It's an incredibly effective, sadly effective way of distracting from what's really important, which is the truth of the matter.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's one of my soapboxes, because that is the most common thing today, whether you're talking about amongst believers or just in secular society. You know, turn on the TV, and if someone has a critical thought about something or calls something out, no one argues against the statement. They attack the person.
Exactly.
Because it's the coward's way out to me.
I believe it was Bertrand Russell, who was not a believer at all. He was a militant atheist who said that mockery is the last-ditch move of a defeated position. And anytime that anybody resorts to personal attacks in that type of discourse, they basically are admitting defeat and admitting, in my mind, that they have no leg to stand on at that point.
Yeah. Yes, and the thought occurred to me, I guess, less recent history. A few years ago, I had this realization dawn upon me that the moment that happens, that's when I sort of, honestly, it sounds odd, but I just sort of I feel peace and I can walk away. Because I know as soon as they start attacking me, the argument's over, and why should I allow myself to engage in now defending my character? Because that person really doesn't know my character.
Especially since your character is not the topic of the discussion.
Yes, exactly. That's sort of another thought that I came to. I used to, in the congregation we were formerly part of, we were very politically active and all about the going out and staging rallies for this and that and all that. And consequently, that would bleed over into my workplace, and I would get into these heated, hardcore arguments with people because, let me tell you, I can argue. And a lot of times it was concerning like some of these terrorist events and Islam and things like that. And I have sort of different views than I once had on it. I don't think that Islam, being what it is, and I'm not disagreeing with anyone that how evil it truly can be, but I think that it is sort of, for lack of better terms, I think Islam is a lackey of the powers that be. Ultimately the powers that be are ones who aren't human. Right. And I don't think that whenever we focus on something like that as the great enemy, we're not really seeing the real puppet master behind the scenes. Right. And it just moves on to another lackey. But anyways, I would get into these things at work, and I had this realization hit me one day. I shouldn't say realization. I think God sort of broke through to me and said, you know what, man?
There you go.
If you know the truth and you feel like you are sincerely speaking the truth, you have to question, why are you speaking that truth to whatever individual or group that you are at the time? And it should be, as a believer, it should be because you have this love to share the truth with them for their own good. Exactly. And if it reaches the point where you're now arguing, where you're now getting emotional over it, and especially when it turns into ad hominem attacks, that's when you should walk away, because if you pursue that, now it's pride.
Yes, it was George MacDonald who famously said this: to give truth to those who love it not is just to give them compounded reason for misinterpretation. And at that point, if someone is ignoring all of your valid points and just attacking your character, they've revealed themselves that they're not a lover of truth anymore.
Yes. I had this woman at work who professed to be a believer, man. She would poke these arguments at me. She even made a statement one time. We'd gotten in this discussion after the Virginia Tech shooting. Okay. And there's some evidence out there that the guy had embraced an Islamic belief system. And I actually heard some things through what I was told, authoritative channels of some things that weren't released to the mainstream media. But anyways, and I was having a discussion at work with someone about it, and this person comes up and inserts herself into the conversation and says that I don't know their hearts. And I said, well, we kind of can know someone's heart by their actions. Like Yeshua said, what's in the heart will come out through the mouth. And she said, well, you can't judge them. And I thought, well, okay, now we're having a moral relativism argument, right? And so I tried to sort of come to some even term here and say, well, what about the Nazis? We can all agree the Nazis were evil, right? And would you believe she said to me, well, you can't judge their hearts either.
Oh, please.
And dude, I got so mad I was shaking, and I had to just walk away because that's kind of personal for me. So then later on, the second argument, and this was around the time that God broke through to me with that insight, was the second time she came up and inserted herself. This was right before the 2008 elections. And you know, all the sorts of things that were being talked about then, particularly the concerns about abortion and that being amped up, and our current leader being very much for it. And so she came up and inserted herself in the conversation and proceeded to try to make an argument, not really based on any facts or any scriptures, that somehow that God endorses abortion in the Bible.
Okay.
Well, man, that was again one of those moments I got so mad, man, and I was starting to shake. And I sort of said something to the effect of, you know what, you can believe what you want to, but don't drag my God into the gutter by saying that. And fortunately, it was time to leave work at that time, so I quickly got out before I said something that I shouldn't have said.
Oh, that's a good move.
But I used to get into those things all the time, and I'll tell you, man, when we got out of that place we were in, congregation we were formerly a part of, I was sitting there, and I asked God, just sort of silently in my mind, okay, God, what now? Now that we're out, what now? And you know what he told me?
Yes.
And this is how I knew it was God, because I would not have done this. And I'm not one to, I used to think we were supposed to run around and listen for God's audible voice and things like that. And I don't believe that now. But I distinctly had these thoughts come into my head that I want you to try to get everyone in your shop together, and I want you to ask forgiveness for being judgmental.
Oh.
And I was like, God, I don't want to do that. That's crazy. And he's like, look, if you want to get past this pain, this damage that was done to you, and the accusation of you being judgmental, then you need to do that. Because the accusation in context in our former congregation, and this is very common when you question things in the body, is that you're called judgmental. And they love to throw out those verses, judge ye not, lest you be judged.
Yep.
But they forget the verses about testing the spirits, right?
Of course.
And so I went to my boss and I asked him, hey, can I do this? And he was like, well, why do you want to do it? And I said, well, honestly, I just felt like I've probably come across that way, and I'm not trying to evangelize to anybody or anything of that nature, but I just feel like I'm supposed to do this. And he said, okay. So I got everyone together and did it, man. And it was such a release, I'm telling you. Wow. And, there was a couple of people that seemed, I could tell were very moved by it and came up and thanked me and told me I never came across that way. And I said to that, well, you don't know everything that goes on in my mind. So, unbeknownst to you, I probably have been. And anyways, that's sort of how I knew though that, hey man, I'm free from that, and that I did make the right decision. But anyways, man, I got to apologize. I'm rambling here and going off on a rabbit trail. You've got the mic.
I can talk a little bit about similar challenges that I had encountering unbelievers. Probably the most heated one is when I was in liberal arts school, and it was a situation where I really wish I had left sooner than I did, because it was evident within the first 15 minutes that I was not just talking to people who were dishonest. I was talking to a group of sociopaths. Honestly, I was talking to people who are pathological, self-absorbed, consistent liars. They will deny even the most obvious of truths if they feel like that truth gets in the way of them being able to, in their own words, create their own reality, so to speak. I even came to the point where they were even trying to deny the statement that 2 + 2 = 4 is an absolute truth statement.
I believe that. Yes.
If I'm lying, I'm dying. It got that bad. They honestly tried to challenge me and tell me that 2 + 2 can equal whatever you want if you hold the opinion about it. And I really wish I had left at that point, because it became abundantly clear to me that I was not talking to people who were in the business of having intellectual discourse. I was talking to people who will say whatever nonsense is on their mind, even if it is a bold-faced lie, and they honestly do not care about anyone or anything but their own ego. I really wish I had left sooner. But at the same time, even though I didn't leave sooner, I do feel like I, at the very least, made some convictions against them and planted a few seeds that at least get them thinking, hopefully sooner or later, prayerfully sooner or later, that will erupt in them and realize just how toxic and poisonous and self-destructive the position they're in. For example, these people were also, of course, not just intellectual relativists, but also moral relativists. And they honestly held the view that people should be allowed to do whatever they want. In other words, last time I checked, we do have a word for that kind of mentality. We call it an anarchist. But that word, sadly, was never tossed around in the discussion. But I eventually came to my point where I knew one major tactic in dealing with people who hold these views is basically to hold their feet to the fire and see if they're really willing to hold those views if it means that their own well-being is on the line for it. So I brought up to one of those people that I was speaking with, asking them, okay, what would you do if somebody threatened your life or your well-being in some way? And for some reason, he brought up the suggestion, what if somebody tried to rape him with a fork? To this day, I do not know why he chose that specific of an example, but that was that. And I responded by saying, okay, fine, what would you do in that situation? And he said, well, he would have to catch me first. And I said, well, okay, so you would try to stop him? And he said, no, I wouldn't try. I would actually stop him. And then I brought in the kicker. And he said, but you realize by doing that, you're interfering with his ability to do whatever he wants. And it was one of those moments where I wish I had a camera, because the reaction on his face was kind of golden. It was one of embarrassment. It was one of shock. It was one of surprise. And unfortunately, I was a bit weak-willed at the time, because at that point, he proceeded to accuse me of, quote-unquote, playing a game with him. And then I just dropped the statement because he just kept shouting me down. But I'm really hoping that that little pinprick at least planted something of a seed that will erupt into a full-blown contrition in folks like that, and in everyone there who has had the displeasure of listening to that train wreck of a discussion.
Wow. Yeah, I would think so. And I think all of that sort of gets encompassed in what is termed postmodern thought.
Yes, exactly.
Whether it's, and it bleeds over into the church, unfortunately. And you see it in that form in, quote, spiritual practices.
Yeah.
And people claiming to hear from God in different ways. And it's sort of that same thought of this sort of relativistic thinking, like, well, the way I hear from God may be different than the way you hear from God. Mm-hmm. But for sure, we see it in the education system. It goes back to what you were talking about people arguing about 2 + 2 = 4. And that I've heard so much about that, actually, that is the very indoctrination they're giving people today, is this relativistic intellectualism that you spoke of, mm-hmm. that there aren't absolutes. And it seems absolutely insane. I mean, well, it
yes, it is.
But the people that teach it, they don't believe that themselves.
No, they don't. Like you said, if you put their feet to the flames, they immediately reveal that this is not what they actually think. I'll tell a funny story that I read in a book one time. There was a professor at a major university in Indiana some time ago who was teaching a class on ethics. And he gave all of his students a term paper assignment. They could write on any ethical topic of their choice, but they had to support their statements with reasons and documentation. Well, one of his students was an atheist, and he was a moral relativist, and he held the view, basically, that there is no objective right and wrong, there is no absolute right and wrong. What's maybe right for one person may not be right for the guy next door, and certainly not for the guy across the ocean. And you like chocolate, I like vanilla, and so forth and so on. So he wrote his term paper around that idea. And he gave his reasons and his documentation, and it was the right length, and it was on time, and he even put it in a stylish blue folder. Well, the professor looked at this, and he, after reading the term paper, he gave the student an F. And he was even kind enough to tell the reason why he gave the student an F. He said, because I don't like blue folders. Well, as you could probably understand, the student was livid at this revelation, and he stormed into the professor's office, his hair a mess, and he just shouted at him, what do you mean you don't like blue folders? That's not fair. That's not right. You didn't judge the paper by its merits. So the professor, put up his hands, tried to calm the student down, and decided, okay, let's talk this over. Let me see exactly what you're speaking about. And he said, oh, yes, you're the one who wrote the term paper about moral relativism, that there are no absolute standards of rightness or fairness or justice. You like chocolate, I like vanilla, to use your vernacular, correct? And the student said yes. And then the professor gave him the kicker. He said, well, then what's with your storming into my office telling me that I'm not being right or fair or just? Didn't you say that it's all a matter of personal taste or preference? And the student said, yes, that's what I really believe. And the professor said, well, fine, I don't like blue. You get an F. And then he ended the conversation, but I do appreciate your willingness to come and speak to me about this, so I'm going to show some leniency in your grading. And by leniency, he meant he crossed out the F and changed it to an A and handed it back to the student. But you can probably understand that the student's view on the subject took a 180-degree turn pretty much overnight, because he realized from his actions right there, not only did he not really believe in this kind of relativism, it was impossible to believe in it. It's impossible to live as though there is no objective right and wrong, because if anyone truly believed that, there's no way they'd be able to survive. You have to hold other people accountable to a standard in order for you to even be able to live. Otherwise, civilization and humanity as we know it is doomed from the word go.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I mean, we could go into then what are the ramifications for that? Because if there is an objective right and wrong, that has to be beyond us. That has to transcend us. Mm-hmm. You know, there has to be something that defines that. And I mean, you even see it with animals.
Yes.
They don't have any sort of training or system, but yet there are certain things. I mean, I've had animals my entire life, and let me tell you, you could tell when they feel guilty about something, and you could tell there are certain things they will and won't do. I mean, of course, there's exceptions, but, you know, from the evolutionary point of view, that shouldn't be the case.
No.
And of course, they'll say, well, certain things aren't done because that has a negative impact on a continuance of the species. But I mean, I think if you follow the trail, that doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. No.
And
it's be about survival of the fittest, and some of the convictions that we hold that really have nothing to do with survival necessarily.
I think that even talking on that point with animals, something I sort of stumbled upon a while back. I shouldn't say stumbled upon, but it was just something I saw in a new light. After the flood, when Noah gets off the ark and God tells him, now you can eat the flesh of animals and so forth and so on. He talks about the shedding of blood and the penalty for that, but he also applies it to animals and says he'll demand an accounting of animals, which then makes, if you stop and think about that, that has certain ramifications. God being perfectly just and perfectly good, how can he be that and hold an animal that has no knowledge of right and wrong responsible for doing something that's wrong? Unless he's given that animal a certain awareness of what's right and wrong. Then he fulfills his perfect nature of being just.
Interesting.
You could kind of go further with that, but that's about as far as I'll go with it right now.
Yeah.
But I think for me that maybe it's an oversimplification, and it's certainly not something an atheist would accept as an argument. But for me, that sort of ends the argument right there.
Yeah, it kind of does. It definitely brings things into a new light and really makes you question certain things about the nature of various living creatures that we have to share this land with.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, and on that topic at least, if you hear any booms, we're experiencing a thunderstorm right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Hopefully we don't have any outages. But anyways, on that note, I think that God... we have all these conflicts in our society, and this is something we're actually going to move on to, everybody, but in a bit. But, you know, we have these conflicts presented to us, like, for example, with animals.
All right.
And you have what's considered the extreme left and the extreme right. And the extreme left typically are those, one of the values they would hold is that we should protect animals. We shouldn't be taking advantage of them and abusing them and all that. And then the extreme right, they'll look at the extreme left for other views that they have, say like abortion.
Right.
And I think this is something we're so prone to. And I think it's such flawed, simplistic thinking. They will take and look at that one thing that's totally disagreeable, say abortion, and then they will look at anything else that person or group promotes and say it all is wrong because this one is wrong.
Right.
And so, for example, with animals, because they have these other views, that means that, well, if you're for protecting animals and all these different things, then that means you're, you know, to use the common vernacular, you're a liberal pansy, right?
Right.
And me, I think that's, personally, I think it's foolishness because, you know, first and foremost, God clearly states in his word that we're supposed to take care of his creation. You know, right. Adam, he placed there to tend to the garden, but he also gave him responsibility over the animals.
Right.
Now,
and over the lesser creatures.
Yes. And I think that you get the other extreme view that they take that and they misinterpret it and say, well, it means we could do anything with them that we want.
Nothing could be further from the truth. It means that you're responsible for caring for them.
Yes. I mean, it would be just the same as saying because you're married and you have authority over your wife, you can do anything with her you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's completely backwards.
Which, unfortunately, there's people who would actually say that.
Oh, yes, I know that.
And so anyways, I guess let's keep that one thought, though, that one foundational sort of thing of how people will look at a group, and because there is something totally obviously wrong on some point, they want to invalidate everything they present.
Right.
When it doesn't necessitate that.
Mm-hmm. No, it doesn't. In fact, good reason would tell you to go against that kind of thinking.
Yes, but of course that's critically lacking today. Unfortunately, we're so polarized.
One of my personal favorite non-fictional books, it's probably my favorite non-fictional book, was Amusing Ourselves to Death, written by Neil Postman. And one of the thesis statements that Neil Postman makes is that as media has developed in this country, the idea of drama and conflict in the narrative has become more and more and more prevalent and important in the common public psyche. And the idea of truth and reason and sensible discourse became less and less and less prevalent with the death of the written word. And as a result, everything that makes for good drama and entertainment is what is championed in every facet of our lives, not just in, literature and fictional entertainment, but in every facet, in politics and education and sports and in everything that we engage in. It has to be entertaining in some way. And the best way that we are entertaining through the principles of narrative and drama is to have conflict. And the more intense the conflict, the more lasting the entertainment. And so it seems as though that many in the higher planes are arranging it so as to keep these flames of conflict as hot as they can and as lasting as they can, because that's what provides the entertainment and thus provides the attention.
Wow. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's funny because I use a term quite often I call entertaining ourselves to death. And I mean, literally that is what we do. And, it's obviously we think we're so advanced, but we really haven't removed ourselves very much from the same sorts of mentalities and things as the Roman gladiatorial games.
Oh,
right?
No. I think our political intensity is just as bad as it was in the higher empire period of Rome.
Yeah, I would agree. And so we, instead of, as some would say, the masses rise up and revolt, we get presented these little entertaining conflicts in order for us to sort of vicariously live through. Instead of us engaging in conflict for something that's right, we just get presented these things. And then, of course, as polarized as things are, then we get conditioned to pick a side.
Oh, yeah.
And my thought, and don't get me wrong, I think there's a time to choose sides, and I think there's a time to take a stand for things.
Of course.
But some of these things, I think the trap is to get involved. And I think you have to know sometimes when to just step back and say, you know what, I'm not going to get involved.
Right. I think the whole practice of picking a side is a means to an end. It's not an end in and of itself.
Yes.
All too often we see picking sides as the end in itself. If you have a side, then you have an identity, and thus your life has purpose just because you're on some side in some tribalistic conflict. When in reality, oftentimes the side you pick is not right, and it's going to lose in the end simply because it's untrue. Then ultimately you're not identifying yourself, you're ultimately just setting yourself up for ruin. And everyone else is setting themselves up for ruin as well. So it's really kind of a existentialist nightmare of meaninglessness that we've cooked for ourselves, and making it seem as though what side you pick is what defines you as a person and gives your life any sort of meaning. Yeah. Wow. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's the sort of thing I experienced, man. I back in the 80s and 90s, I was sort of your classic punk rocker, nonconformist, get a mohawk and everything else. And of course, some part of that is still my identity, but it's not really my identity. It's just, a reflection of sort of maybe some part of the real me, but it's not me. And sort of, I came to this realization with that, though, back in the late 90s, that you know what? When I put this shirt and this jacket on or put this mohawk up or whatever, all I'm doing is putting on a uniform and limiting myself to this sort of box instead of being, an individual.
Right.
And, and then there's sort of the bigger thing, beyond something simplistic like that with these sort of movements that we see out there, that when you decide, you get told to pick a side and you decide to do it, that now you're totally engaged, and it's almost like being on a roller coaster that you no longer have control of because your identity's invested in it. And therefore, if you get off of it, you've lost your identity. And
exactly.
And it causes this sort of cognitive dissonance, right? Because now the facts are totally going against who you thought you were and what you thought the world and meaning was.
Yeah, that's kind of the scary thing. That's really why it troubles me so much that people are trying to insert their identities in so many things that are so objectively worthless. They try to insert their identity in their skin color. They try to insert their identity in their sexual orientation or their sexual preferences. They try to insert their identity in their whether they refer to themselves as a man or a woman or something else entirely. Or they insert their identity in what sports team they support or what political party they support or what college they went to. And all of these things are just objectively so worthless. I mean, they are accessories to your identity, but they are not the crux of your very being. I mean, when you come out the womb, you don't ascribe or affirm any of these things just yet. And when you go to the grave, all of that is dead with you. So it really does trouble me, and it really saddens me and makes my heart sink, seeing so many people trying to root their identities in so many things that are man-made and will eventually become dust.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like you mentioned it's like the sports thing, man.
Yes.
And I hear it all the time at work. It's probably why the example comes up for me, and it just drives me crazy. I've never been a sports guy really anyways, but there's a few thoughts I have on that. And, one of them is that, and hear me out here.
Go ahead.
In America, particularly, we have linked certain things together as being synonymous with each other. And therefore, if you take one of those links out, somehow now everything's called to question. So what I mean by that is we've gone through this sort of, whether we self-impose it upon ourselves or whether an institution has imposed it upon us or whether it's the media or whatever, we have linked the idea of being a patriotic American to also being a Christian. And then I think a lot of it's due to the school system and everything else. With the sports thing, we've linked that to being patriotic. So therefore, in sort of a simplistic way of thinking, we've linked being enthusiastic and supportive of sports to our Christianity even. And I say that because I've experienced it in conversations with people, reading in between the lines of their reactions and their words back to me when I sort of refuse to get caught up into stuff, and I just flat out tell them, oh man, I don't really care about that. And then they just sort of, well, first you get a blank stare and then you'll get this sort of like questioning of your patriotism. And if you allow yourself to further get into a discussion, which you may or may not do, often I don't, but if you sort of counter that with, well, I don't invest my identity in this sort of patriotic view, and while I love the values of my country, I question where it's at and whether it really fulfills those values it expresses, then you get sort of people, I've had people straight up question me, well, you're a Christian, right? And I'll say, well, yeah. They'll then sort of you can see the conflict on their face. Well, how can you not be supportive of the, American apple pie and all that stuff, right? And be a Christian? And I'll say, well, where in the Bible does it say being an American patriot or any national patriot is synonymous with being a believer?
Right.
And I think, people don't even stop and think about any of that because we're so really immersed in all of that. And I mean, personally, I think a lot of it is by design. And, it's like I sort of had this growing disgust when I go into a church and I see these flags up there You got the American flag up there, and then a lot of times you'll have the, what do they simply call it? The Christian flag. Right.
Yeah, that thing.
And it's like, well, for one thing, there's no biblical instruction for having a Christian flag. But that aside, even if there was, you're going to put an American flag up there and make it synonymous with that.
Right. And that's, it can almost be considered a form of idolatry in a way when it goes along those lines. And I think a lot of it, I think some of it can be rooted in what are useful but situationally problematic factors of human nature. We are pattern-seeking animals because we were made to be that way. We were designed to seek out patterns, and we were designed to try to find meaning or messages within these patterns. And so oftentimes we will make these arbitrary connections because in our cultural experiences, they so often find themselves in the same space. So we derive from that they must be in some way intrinsically linked with one another. But 9 times out of 10, there really is no connection. As Sigmund Freud is oftentimes misquoted as saying, sometimes a rainbow is just a rainbow. Meaning not every pattern necessarily has a message to it. And if it does, it's not necessarily the first message that comes to your mind. So all of these arbitrary links that we see between, Christianity and, to use C.S. Lewis's words, Christianity and patriotism or Christianity and conservatism is oftentimes just a perversion of the fundamental good of the gospel itself. And it's really unfortunate that we let ourselves get carried away by that kind of, I'll just use that word again, idolatry.
Yeah, I agree. It's like, you hear the argument from, for lack of better terms, the extreme left within Christianity, where they'll say, well, Yeshua was all about helping the poor and feeding the poor and all these different things. So therefore, you should be willing to do this or that or give up this or that.
Right.
And he certainly was.
Yes.
And I think with so many things, it's the same, that the truth is not this side or that side. It's somewhere in the middle.
It's its own thing entirely. It's independent of sides. That's how I've always held the truth.
And so I think you get the, quote, conservative side, which, I hate to go back to my point earlier, but they then look at that and say, oh, because these people are this, and they're espousing that means that they espouse is not valid either. So they'll say, well, we shouldn't do any of that because, we shouldn't go out and feed the poor and all that because these leftists, that's what they want.
Right. That's completely erroneous because, just because the people who hold the views may be, of a poor character, that doesn't mean that everything they're saying is false.
Yes, the invalidating the people does not invalidate the point.
Exactly. And that's an error that far too many of us make because, again, we've been unfortunately caught up in the tribalism that is so prevalent in our current American state of affairs.
I keep meaning to go back to that. I love the fact that you use that term, and I'll admit my bias on that because it's a term I've used a lot where I came to the conclusion that tribalism, we're no further removed from that than ancient people were.
No,
and
not at all.
The root of so many problems, it's not a racial difference. I mean, biblically speaking, there aren't races. We're all, we're all the same. I mean, even according to science, we're so much the same. It's absurd to make a differentiation. Mm-hmm. But the root of our problems is our natural tribal behavior. And that could go from the scale of a family, which tribes are built upon, or it could go to the scale of a national level and different groups that that are just in opposition to each other. It's just that same mentality, just like you said, join the tribe, pick a tribe.
Exactly. And it's pretty much accepted as a common truth, even in anthropology, which I'm sure you know as well as I do is not a hard science, that it is understood even there that race is certainly a social construct. It doesn't really exist. What kind of ethnic identity a person holds can actually change depending upon who you ask. I mean, even in this country, going over history, I was kind of shocked to find out that what exactly counts as a white person seemed to change every 20 odd years or so. Like you go back to 1860, Irish Americans were not considered white. In fact, as I learned watching that film 12 Years a Slave, there were even Irish American peoples who were subjugated and victimized by the forced servitude of American slavery.
Yes.
And they were also victims of Jim Crow laws. There were Jim Crow laws that told people that you need not apply if you were Irish. But, in common, particularly in the Negro population, yeah, Irish Americans are considered white. But after that, Italian Americans were not considered white for a while. And then Jewish Americans were not considered white. And actually, even among white supremacists, even today, they're still not considered white.
Oh,
Anti-Semitism is still a huge element of the white supremacist ideology even today. So to a lot of people in my family, they just consider them all white, but they don't consider themselves that. So you have to stand back and ask the question, who's right and who's wrong? Well, objectively, nobody's really right because there is no right answer to this. It's all arbitrary. It's all a social construct. It's like, I don't know, arguing over which color is the best color. There is no right answer to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I had this thought I wanted to present to you, or this question I wanted to present to you as you were talking. Have you ever experienced this? It infuriates me when I hear about it. I mean, it's just absurd and disgusting and just really just a horrible thing to say and do. I hate political correctness, so I refuse to use politically correct terms, and I don't think you would care for them either. So anyway, so being a Black American, and being intelligent and having an education and having a value system that you have you ever experienced in having conversations, especially particularly with other Black people, have you ever been told that you weren't really Black because of your values and your beliefs and your intelligence?
Man, I get told that I'm not Black enough for a multitude of reasons. It's not just because I'm intelligent and educated. It's because of the kinds of foods that I enjoy, or because the kinds of movies that I like to watch, or the kind of music that I like to listen to. The fact that I would rather listen to a soundtrack or a film score from Hans Zimmer or the latest album from Carl Jenkins miles before I even think about listening to the latest album by Drake or Beyonce, that somehow makes me not Black enough. The fact that I'm not all that fond of Ebonics. People have been making fun of the way I talk as long as I can remember, even in the church. And I've always gone to primarily Black churches. And even there, they would always make fun of the way I talk. They would make fun of the way I dress. They would make fun of the thoughts that I have. Some people say it's a blight on my Blackness of the fact that I didn't go to an HBCU. In either times in which I went to college, I didn't go to an HBCU, an historically Black college or university, for those who are not familiar with that acronym. So, constantly. It's a constant thing. And it's really troubling to me because there was this one time my brother was actually crashing at my apartment for a while when he was in transition after graduation. And he's a bit more immersed in the identity politics of Black Americans than I am. I would say he's a lot more immersed in that than I am. I'm not immersed in that at all. And one of the questions he kind of hypothetically raised to me is, what exactly does it mean to be a Black man in America? And I didn't want to say this because I didn't want to incite a heated argument, but my honest answer to that question is that it's a stupid question. It's an incredibly stupid question because it's unanswerable. Because any answer that you give to that question, someone else can pipe up, okay, so if I'm not doing that, I'm no longer a Black man? And your honest answer would have to be, well, no. Because honestly, all that question does is really just reinstigate behavioral stereotypes with regards to races, which, if I'm not mistaken, is something that Black Americans for decades have been fighting against, not trying to instigate. We're trying to get rid of the notion that your skin color determines your character. As Dr. King famously said, that your content of character is what matters, your skin color doesn't matter at all, and that's what you're supposed to be judged upon. So people who want to instigate this type of rhetoric in which we are supposed to necessarily attribute behaviors or identity traits or character traits to you on the basis of your skin color it's not progress, it's regress.
Yes, absolutely. I've made the point many times that I think these sorts of things, these sorts of thoughts, like linking your cultural identity, your cultural expression to your race, which I hate to even use that term, but we have to use some term. I think that is a very purposeful thing that's done in order to keep that said race down. I mean, these are the sorts of things, as you sort of express, that people were fighting against, being stereotyped by the clothes you wear or the way you talk or whatever. And I mean, the thought occurred to me as you mentioned Dr. King. By the standards today, if he was to walk on the scene today, he would be told that he's not really Black.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think there was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the show, there was a TV show on Cartoon Network called The Boondocks. It was a highly show, and honestly, you don't have to be black in order to enjoy that show, even though the creator of the show is black, and it does seem at first glance to be primarily directed to a black audience. It was a show that engaged all kinds of audiences, particularly in the Western society. And there was one episode of that show that actually won a Peabody Award, which is one of the most prestigious awards that a TV production can win. It was a particular episode that presented the speculative notion that Dr. King was actually suffering from a coma and came back to modern times. And he was attacked left and right by every person in the black community that you can imagine because of the views that he held or would hold if he were alive and among us today, and seeing the kind of conflicts that we're going on with now. And so that kind of realization really just struck me that, yes, between Dr. King and Malcolm X, it really seemed like Malcolm X won in the end with the way that the black community is the way it is now.
Yeah, sadly, I would say so. I mean, Malcolm X, you got the Nation of Islam and the Marxist philosophy, which is really, it's maybe some of these groups don't identify as Nation of Islam, but they certainly have the same mentality and the same sort of approach to things. And definitely with the sort of Marxist philosophy, it's sort of hand in hand. And I mean, it really is tragic. I mean, I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that when you victimize a race and tell them they're victims, you sort of, in the end, I think you keep them in a victim state by sort of instilling this hopelessness.
Mm-hmm. Actually, it's been clinically proven among psychologists that kind of constant state of victimhood actually produces mentally and emotionally unstable people. It actually is directly a catalyst to mental illnesses like depression and anxiety, and even in some extreme cases like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Is caused by this kind of victimhood mentality. Because if you're going to constantly going around thinking that there is just this nameless, faceless, undefined, phantasmagoric, nightmarish, eldritch, Lovecraftian entity somewhere out in the ether that's out to get you simply because of your skin color, you're never going to escape that kind of mentality, and you're never going to really and truly live up to your full potential if you're constantly thinking, oh, I'm being oppressed.
Yeah. And I mean, I could even speak from my own personal life that, me and people I knew, we had a similar mentality of, well, the whole system's against us, and that, we're not going to, back in the 80s, we always had this expectation of, nuclear holocaust and all that.
Yeah.
And we had this hopelessness, and a lot of people, myself included, for a long time did not get with life and have any hope for the future because we figured there was no future.
Yeah.
And you just grab onto that enough and believe that enough, and you really won't have a future. And I think that's what's so tragic today. And, I've thought about going back to Dr. King a lot, that if he was alive today, how much his heart would be broken to see everything he fought for and achieved just really being just stepped on and cast away, and how things are being done. And it's very analogous to Moses and what he experienced, I think.
Yeah.
They get right out of Egypt and all this stuff has happened. And then he goes up and God, he physically encounters God, and God physically inscribes these commandments on tablets. And he comes down like, wow, I've got this great thing from God, guys. And what's the first thing he sees? Right?
Paganism.
Yeah, they're worshiping this golden calf and all the things that are implied that go along with that. I think we've moved into the territory that one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, Tyrone had posted some post on Facebook concerning current events when, all these things that are going on today. This is July 15th. We're sort of right in the heat of it with the police conflicts, like Dallas and the police shootings and all the Black Lives Matters groups staging these protests all around the country. And you had expressed some opinions about it. And I was particularly intrigued by a comment you had made concerning things you're trying to do in your own personal life, as you had said, in your own limited way, although I don't know how limited it is. As you had sort of said earlier, you plant seeds and, you're not always the harvester, but you did good in planting those seeds, and you just don't necessarily get to see it. But anyways, so I was very intrigued by that, and I just really thought it would be awesome. I'd already wanted to get you on the show, but to have you talk about your view on it. And because me being white, I could sit here and talk about it, but it ain't the same. So I guess on that point, just whatever thoughts you have, I'd really be interested in hearing them.
Well, honestly, I think the best way for me to combat all of this tension that's going on between the races is basically to just live out the example that you want to see. And all my life, I have been very, very successful in that. I didn't, like I said, one of the things that I think has helped with that is the fact that I didn't go to an historically black college or university, because I wouldn't have had that opportunity in what is usually one of the most developmental parts of any American person's life, to interact with people who do not share my ethnic identity. I went to an international art school. I made friends with people from literally all over the planet while I was there. I was friends with people from Beijing, China. Some of my fellow classmates were from Bangladesh or India. One of my animation professors was from the UK. My drawing professor was from Spain. My animation history professor was from Uganda. My manager when I was working on the school was from Lebanon. My supervisor there was Guatemalan. So I was able to interact with people from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. And yes, a good number of them were also whites, were also Caucasian. And I had nothing of the kinds of experiences that so many black people in my life told me that I'm more or less guaranteed to face simply because I'm black. And if I interact with a white person, basically my mentality when dealing with white people, if I ever interact with white people, it really struck me that the message I got from the black people in my life is that you are supposed to think that every white person you come across and interact with is racist by default and bigoted against you and thinks negatively of you in some way until proven otherwise. Basically, they are guilty of racism until proven innocent. Thankfully, I was sharp enough, even at that time, to realize, well, that kind of mentality is itself racist. You are assuming something negative about these people simply because they're white. Well, how exactly are you going to combat the evils of racism if you're holding on to racist ideologies yourself? So I immediately did away with that, and it was quite easy to do so because I don't think I ever genuinely and sincerely held those views myself. I know in my younger years, I kind of parrot-talked the kind of things other people in my community would say when I was growing up. But they were never really genuine thoughts that I held because I had nothing in my experience to validate them. I had nothing in my experience to validate the idea that every white person I came across was thinking negatively of me in any way. They treated me no differently than they treated anybody else. So I cannot hold on to this kind of prejudicial mindset with regards to white people when my own experience constantly refuted it. And so I try to live that out with everybody that I come across, white, black, and otherwise. And I show them, this is my life. This is exactly the kind of interactions that I've had. And if I were to hold the same mentality that so many young and old black people have towards white people, I would have destroyed so many opportunities and had so many relationships ruined before they could even start and blossom. And so many opportunities that I would have even had as a disciple of Christ that I would not have been able to fill out had I held this kind of prejudicial and intellectually erroneous mentality. So living that out is really the way in which I feel like I am doing my best to contribute to the fight against racism.
Wow, I think that sort of can be applied to, or it should be applied by all of us in our walks. I mean, that's really what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to preach at people or argue with them, but we're supposed to witness to them ultimately through our own lives and how we live our lives. Mm-hmm. And I just think, wow, you hit the nail on the head there with that, man. What would you say is the hook for people that feel that way? Like, what do you think keeps them in that sort of place of expecting everyone else to be racist against them and to keep sort of projecting that?
I think, honestly, we have tied so many advantages and benefits to the state of victimhood that so many of us are clamoring for it in order to get those benefits, even though we do not wholeheartedly deserve it. So many of us have not actually personally gone through the troublesome burdens of victimhood in order to glean its advantages, or it's really erroneous to use this word, but rewards of victimhood. So by latching onto that and by holding to this view that we're constantly being oppressed in some way or another, it just has to be that way. Even if you see no evidence of direct oppression, it just has to be that way in one way or another. Then it instigates us into a state of what I would consider to be spiritual pride. Because if you're a victim, you feel in some way morally superior to the people you believe are victimizing you. And that gives them the opportunity to be able to morally lash out at people, even if it's without explicit justification. that could be one catch to it. I do think it's a good deal of it is just plain pride and arrogance and a desire to feel superior to others in some way or another that keeps people into this state of victimhood, because with victimhood comes the idea that you're entitled to special treatment or special privilege or special kinds of positions of superiority over those that you feel are victimizing you.
Wow, that's interesting. I never really thought about that, but that sort of victimization mentality is sort of a pride. Since you put it the way you put it, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I suppose part of it also goes back to the tribalism, and I suppose part of it also is sort of our basic human nature of, I'm in this place that I'm in, and I don't want to blame myself for it, so I need to find someone else to blame.
Oh, yeah.
And then, of course, when you have the mainstream media and entertainment offering you an answer for who to blame, you know, it's just sort of, I guess, a natural progression there.
Yes, absolutely. And it's really sad that the mainstream news and press media does everything it can to try to keep that fire alive, that evil fire of pride and victimhood, as hot and as continuous as it possibly can, to the point where they're even ignoring all of the facts or jumping the shark right before even any of the facts can come in order to, as we use the popular term, race bait people into that kind of indignation that is really oftentimes unwarranted.
They will literally call out an evil action by one group and flatly say who these people are and what they believe or whatever the case may be. But yet another group will commit the same act of evil, and you'll see them literally refuse to say their race or their religious system or whatever. Of course, the perfect example today is with, you know, Muslim terror attacks.
Of course.
There's this refusal by the media to call them Muslim at all. You know, and that's a point I've made a lot, because I had my change of views on it, my convictions about it.
Okay.
That Islam itself, the system, is utterly evil. But the people aren't. They're enslaved.
Yeah.
But there are those amongst them who choose to embrace evil and commit evil. But I don't think your average Muslim who's been immersed in it and that's all they've ever known, they think they're doing good.
Yeah, honestly, common term is that they've been radicalized. And there is a good chunk of Muslims who have been radicalized. Not all of them are terrorists, mind you, but several of them have been radicalized in one way. That is, they probably do believe that Sharia law should be in place. And that's one of the scary things about Islam, is that Islam is not just a religious worldview. It's not just a theological or supernatural worldview to hold. It's also a system of government.
Yes.
Yeah, that is inextricably tied to the ideology of Islam. It is also a system of government, as how things in civilization should be run is held in Islamic teaching. It's right there in the Quran. So oftentimes when we try to separate the two, there are many Muslims who will separate the two, but I see oftentimes the difference in the evil of the ideology of Islam, and I do feel to a certain degree justified in saying that. My own mother was raised Muslim.
Really?
She wasn't radicalized, to my understanding, but she was raised in the Islamic faith. She did have a Quran. In fact, I still remember vividly when she decided ultimately to burn the Qurans that she had had since childhood, because they carried a lot of sentimental value to her. But she's Christian now, and she doesn't hold to those ideologies anymore. In those Quranic teachings, it is very, very clear that Islam does demand that governments be run a certain way, and the way it is run is, as you said, it is just downright evil. It's dehumanizing, it's misogynistic, it's misanthropic, it's so many things that are so corrupt that are intrinsic to the ideology. But thankfully, yes, a lot of the people who hold to the ideology do not reflect that evil.
I had a thought or a question to pose to you concerning that. There is such a paradoxical mindset amongst, well, the mainstream media in America and a lot of the population in America, especially groups who would describe themselves as victims, right? Like, say, for example, a group like, I hate to keep bringing it up, but a group like Black Lives Matter, or the sort of other groups that sort of fall in the same sort of approach, mentality, philosophy. And there's this paradoxical thing, because those same people, as many right-wing conservatives will call them, people on the left,
yes,
they will, on one hand, condemn things like racism and sexism and enslavement of peoples, whether it's a woman or a person of another race. But yet, on the other hand, they will refuse to call that out in Islam, which is an extreme violator of all those ideals. I mean,
absolutely.
Islam, when you go overseas, they're extraordinarily racist, say, against black people. And you read some of the writings they say, and it's just sickening. The only people that they say worse thing about are Jews. And and with the things they say about women and the things they think they have the right to do to women, and then the things you see them do.
Yes.
And so I guess my question that I'm posing to you, I mean, I have my opinions on it. Why do you think that paradox exists? Why do you think these people will, on one hand, be opposed to all those things, but yet embrace Islam and never at all acknowledge that they are doing those very same things that they themselves say they hate?
Well, it kind of ties back to my first encounters with people of this leftist mentality, is that they are inherently hypocrites. Hypocrisy seems to be something that is almost like one of the 10 commandments of leftism. You must be a hypocrite. So it does not surprise me at all that they would hold this kind of hypocrisy in being so anti-racism and anti-homophobia and anti-misogyny, and yet at the same time be so defendant of Islam, which is intrinsically racist and misogynistic and homophobic, or, they still publicly execute people who engage in homosexual behavior over there. And yet they seem to defend them with an iron fist. It's still vividly in everyone's imagination. The shooting at the gay club in Orlando, Florida, that was clearly made by someone who holds radical Islamic views, but they're not going to call him out on that. They're going to blame it all on the radical right or, hatred of gays that's supposedly being spread by Christians in this country, instead of the ideology that's explicitly stated by the guy who actually did the killing.
Yes, I was actually thinking of that right before you said it. They refused to say that he was Muslim, and they refused to say that it was an act of Islamic terror. And you're right. There were reports coming out in this sort of concerted effort, this unified voice to say that it's because of Christians and all of our opposition to homosexuality invading all aspects of our lives that created a climate of hate that caused this to happen. Mm-hmm. That's what they're saying.
Yes. And because so much of what goes on in leftism is based on lies, if you're going to be a liar 9 times out of 10, you're going to be a hypocrite. So seeing that kind of hypocrisy does not surprise me. It angers me. It saddens me. But I cannot say that it surprises or baffles me to one iota, because I'm so familiar with how much hypocrisy is enshrined in this kind of mentality.
Yeah, as you said, you experience it in universities. I've heard people talk about these sorts of things. I've never personally experienced it, and I can't imagine actually dealing with it. I don't think, honestly, I have to admit, I probably would have been able to have dealt with it as well as you did, because I just have a bit too much of a temper, I suppose. Maybe now that I'm older, I could, but not in my 20s.
Oh, yeah. And I don't think I even handle it as well as I probably could have, knowing now what I know. If I knew then what I know now, it probably would have been a different situation.
Sorry for the abrupt ending, but this is the close of part 1. I decided to split this into 2 parts as the interview ended up totaling about 2.5 hours, and I thought that might be a bit much for listeners. Hopefully, as time goes on and I get better at crafting these things, it will flow a little bit better. Stay tuned. Hopefully, part 2 will be posted very soon. I wanted to hurry up and get at least one part out because the topics we have covered, I think, are so timely and I think really need to be out there right now. Again, as I always say, thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. Thanks for your following us. We really consider it a blessing. Thank you, and God bless. Breaking the Silence is a production of Fight the Lies Ministries. Visit us at ftlradio.net. This program is released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Intro and outro music by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com.